My name is Gail Weisswasser. I'm one of the owners of Wonderland. My co-owner back there is Amy Joyce. We're together the two owners of Wonderland. If this is your first time at Wonderland, welcome. If this is not, welcome back. We're happy to have you here tonight. One thing I will make a quick announcement is we have lots of events, and so if you're interested in learning about our events, grab an events flyer for June, which we'll have at the counter on the way out. So I'd like to introduce our speakers tonight. Sharon Musher is Professor of History at Stockton University. She writes and teaches social, cultural, and oral history with a focus on the New Deal, Jewish women, and motherhood. She's the author of Democratic Art, The New Deal's Influence on American Culture. And beyond academia, Sharon is on the boards of the Jewish Publication Society and the Living New Deal. She lives in Philadelphia with her husband, two of her 3 daughters, and her dog. And I need to know what kind of dog.
I have a golden doodle. And I think I gave you an earlier version because it doesn't, of course, have the name of the new book, which is Promised Lands.
Promised Lands, a new book, which is what you've all come to hear tonight. Yes. And tonight, Sharon's going to be in conversation with Miriam Eisenstein. She is the elder daughter of Rabbi Ira and Judith Eisenstein. As an attorney, she served from 1969 to 1999 in the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. She holds degrees in secondary education and special education and taught for a number of years before and after her legal career. Mim lives in Chevy Chase, Maryland, with her spouse of 30 years, Carol Stern, over here. And both women are active members of Adat Shalom, Reconstructionist congregation in Bethesda.
Yay.
So I will let you take it from here.
Terrific. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Sharon, tell us something about why you wrote this book. What spurred you to cover your grandmother's travels?
Terrific. Before I answer that first question, I just wanted to thank Wonderland Books for having us, to thank Gail, Amy, and Chris for hosting us, to thank my brother-in-law and sister, Sarah and Matt Brenner, for introducing me to Wonderland Books, to thank Miriam Eisenstein. Am I calling you Mim? We didn't even decide if I was that. We probably should have done that beforehand.
That's my name.
Okay, good. To thank Mim for being in conversation with me, to thank my cousins for being here, Rebecca and John and Mark and Kathy and Adam, and now I'm going to get into trouble if I name everyone, and my niece and my nephew for being here. It's a family affair, and it's really nice to be in conversation, and I'm excited to meet other people. So the first question was, why did I write this book?
Now, the first question is, how are you related?
Yes, well, so okay. I have to answer the question of how am I related to answer the question of what is this book and how did I come to write it. So if you'll bear with me, I'm going to do a little bit of family tree, in addition to having thanked everybody in the room, and you can try and figure out who I'm related to and who I'm not. So this book, Promised Lands, Hadassah Kaplan, and the Legacy of American Jewish Women in Early 20th-Century Palestine, is the story of my grandmother. My grandma was Hadassah Kaplan, later Musher, and I am Sharon Musher. She was the second daughter of Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan, who was the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism. Some of you may be very familiar with that. Some of you may not be. This is an American form of Judaism, which is perhaps best known, and we can debate what it's best known for promoting the idea of a Jewish community center in terms of Judaism as an evolving civilization, and also founding the bat mitzvah, the rite of passage for American Jewish girls. And that rite of passage he founded in part because Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan was the father of 4 daughters. His eldest daughter, Judith Kaplan, later Eisenstein, was Mim's mother. So that puts together the picture. Judith herself was well known for many, many things in addition to becoming the first bat mitzvah. In fact, I know Mim doesn't like it when she's talked about in that way. It was something that her father encouraged her to do when she was 12 and a half. She, of course, lived a very long life, not of course, but she happened to live a very long life. She was a musician, she was a musicologist, she was an educator, she was known for many other things, and in fact, she deserves a biography of her own. But that is not the book that I have written here. I have written a book about my grandma, who was a person I loved very much. She was the second of those 4 daughters of Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan, and unlike her older sister Judith, who was very much the disciple of her father. She asked lots of questions. She was really quite precocious. My grandma took a little bit longer to find her way. She too was very bright and athletic and beautiful and lots of other things. She went to Hunter College. She became a teacher. So she started Hunter College at 15 and a half. She graduated in 1931. The middle of the Great Depression, and she began teaching. And she taught in Manhattan in a public school, and she learned in the middle of the summer, she got a letter from the school superintendent, and they told her that they no longer had a position for her. And she, of course, had 3 strikes against her as a young female Jewish educator in the midst of the Great Depression. And there were very few people who were getting any kind of jobs, particularly jobs in education from that kind of background. There were many people who were vying for those positions, and many more of them were going to men at that point in time. And she and her parents had an epiphany the same Sabbath afternoon, and Hadassah wrote about this both in her letters and also in her diary, that the thing she should do was to go to mandatory Palestine for the year. She and her parents agreed. I don't know. I have a daughter who's taken a gap year now. We're in 2020. I guess she did it in 2022 or something like that. But it's quite unusual thing for parents to agree that this is something that they should do, and for this to be the experience that she had. And she wrote letters to her parents and her 3 siblings, and they wrote back to her. And I inherited the complete archive. In addition to the diaries where she wrote the stories that were a little more scandalous that she wouldn't write home to Mama and Papa, and her photographs, which I'm looking at Rebecca and my sister Sarah, where's Sarah, who will remember that, Grandma Hadassah taught us to meticulously label everything, that you had to say who was in the pictures and what the date was and the like. So when she passed away, she lived a very long life. She lived to 101, she passed away in 2013. And I guess the piece to tell of this story beforehand was in 1994, the summer that I graduated from college, and now I'm fully dating myself. Before I went to graduate school, I did a master's in economic and social history in England for 2 years. And that summer, I spent a whole lot of time with my grandma. And I had just written a thesis, and I was really interested in Jewish history and women's history and oral history. And so I started asking her questions about her life. And it was really old school. We didn't have phones. I just started jotting things down in my little green leather notebook that she talked about. And she talked a whole lot about this year that she spent in Palestine. And she talked about it as being this transformational year, the most important year of her life. She was 82 at the time. And I was really intrigued by that year. So when she passed away at 101, I asked my parents to look for her diary, because I didn't know anything about the letters, but I knew she had kept diaries, and I thought at the time that she would have kept date books, which is what she kept her whole life. And again, it was before we had the phone, so it said, who you were meeting, where you were meeting them, when you were meeting them. There wasn't any other information about how you felt about things. But Laurel Thatcher Ulrich is a historian, emeritus historian at Harvard, and she wrote this book that I had read when I was in graduate school about Martha Ballard, a midwife in the colonial period, the American colonial period. And she took this story that had just small fragments in it, this diary that was so unusual, and she read behind the lines to try to recreate what the colonial period was like. And I wanted to do that with my grandma's diary, and it turned out that she had much more than just these small little calendars. She had these letters and these photographs, and I tried to read them against one another to recreate that year. She spent 9 months in Mandatory Palestine. She spends 2 months traveling back through Europe in 1933, and I wanted to use it as a window to understand the emerging relationship between American Jews and explicitly American Jewish women and Palestine.
I can think of better times for asking this question, but the term Zionism, has always had multiple meanings. In 1932, during the British Mandate, what image do you think your grandmother, Hadassah, had of Zionism? And where do you think she got that image, both before she went, while she was there, and after she came back?
Okay. So it's a good question. And in order to answer it, I have to take 2 steps back. The first one is to offer the context, because I've learned I've had a really wonderful time getting feedback from people on this book. This is my second book. One of my goals of this book was that people I knew might actually read it. And I think the last one was really important too, don't get me wrong, but I didn't quite get as many readers. And one of the things that I've really loved is people have given me feedback, and they've told me things that they learned. So one of the things that I heard from one of my readers, who's very active in the Jewish community and is my age, and I just assumed that she had known this, so I need to step back and point this out. She didn't know that most people were not Zionists in the early 20th century. This was a minority position. Among Jews, it was a minority position. If you were Reform, then you thought that America was your Zion. If you were Orthodox, then you thought Zionism was heretical. If you were a Yiddishist, then you believed in the diaspora. So why would you believe in a Jewish homeland? If you were socialist, then you thought that nationalism was bourgeois and totally problematic. So I wanted to set it into that context. So this is kind of a minority position. Now, how do I know what Hadassah's vision of Zionism was? Well, that depends on the sources that I have to access this story. And that makes answering this question a little bit more difficult. So I could give you a pat answer because I have my own sense that I have developed, but I also want to give you a sense of how a historian thinks and comes up with these kinds of analyses. So I could tell you much more about Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan, my great-grandfather's vision of Zionism, because he kept a diary more or less his whole life. And in addition to that, he published books, including ones explicitly about Zionism. So I can read what he had to say, and if I'm trying to figure out what my grandmother's perspective is, I would talk about it being shaped in part by her family, particularly her father. I would talk about it being shaped by the Jewish education that she had. A part of that came from the SAJ, the Society for the Advancement of Judaism, where she was a member of the congregation and went to Hebrew school. She also had a Hebrew tutor, Abe Halkin. I would say that the most influential force for her, however, was camp. And if any of you are anywhere near the place where I am right now, which is in packing week, about to send 2 of my children, thankfully the second one, off to camp because she was supposed to be going to Israel this Friday, and that's another story that we can talk about or not. Camp hugely shaped Hadassah's vision of Zionism, and it was shaped by the counselors and the heads of the camp, many of whom were her father's students, and the wives of her father's students, and both the men and the women were his students. So I can tell you something about his approach towards Zionism and how that might have shaped her vision. But I'm not entirely sure how intellectually engaged she was with that vision of it. So if we start with the camp vision of it, what was generally taught in camps in the 1930s was a pioneering guardsman, a vision of Palestine that didn't particularly have, and I know this is a question we're going to next, Arab Palestinians in it, even though they represented 85% of those people who were living in mandatory Palestine at the time. It was a romanticized vision of building up a Jewish homeland and creating a Jewish cultural center. Now, Mordechai Kaplan's vision of Zionism was much more sophisticated than that, and was based and was different. There are so many competing visions, even in those influencing Hadassah. So if we take her tutor, Abe Halkin, for example, he thought if you were a Zionist, you had to go to Palestine. But that wasn't the approach of Mordechai Kaplan. He saw it as a cultural center and was more focused on the Achad Ha'am vision of it than the political notion of building a state, especially given the demographics there at the time. That wasn't really something that he could even imagine, although he does imagine it in his diary at different points. Because Hadassah she writes letters. I have her letters from camp, so I have a sense of what she's writing about, but she doesn't write. She writes about singing, she writes about dancing, and that's in Hebrew. There are Hebrew tables. There's a lot of educational components that happen at camp. There were also educational components that Mordechai Kaplan was very critical of, including how critical he was of Judith, who at the time, from 15 on, was running the whole music program at the camp, and he shows up to see his 4 daughters and is so skeptical about, are they learning, aren't they learning, are they just repeating the words and the like. So I hope I've answered your question. There were many competing visions of Zionism. Hadassah doesn't write explicitly about, she writes about Jewish culture, she writes about Hebrew, she writes about dancing and music before she goes. In her letters when she's there, she does meet Judah Magnus, who is the head of Hebrew University. It is now 100 years, actually right now, since the founding of Hebrew University. And she reads Magnus's work about binationalism. She comments on it a little bit in some of her notes. So I use that to try to extrapolate what she knew and didn't know. And if we talk about afterwards, I think more of she does write afterwards, and she continues to correspond with Israelis, but because she's a person I knew throughout her life, I can comment more on what I saw of what Zionism meant to her. After the State of Israel and after she marries my grandpa Sidney, she's very involved in the symphony, she's involved in the arts, she's involved philanthropically, and so for her, I think a lot of Zionism as an American Zionist had to do with engagement and giving back and philanthropy.
Yeah, I think some of these people may not realize that the Hebrew language was not the language of teaching in the Hebrew schools, except for purposes of prayer. The whole Hebraist movement, which is intrinsically Zionist because it assumed there were going to be people talking this language somewhere. And so in the 30s, very few people were learning Hebrew as a spoken language, and even the camps, Moden, where she was, they did not. It was not done yet. And that kind of Hebraist, essentially Zionist slant to education was very new in this country at that point. I'm sure that's a surprise to people because they're just so used to it at this point. They can't imagine it ever was different. Anyway.
Can I say one more thing
Sure.
apropos of that? So if anyone's interested in learning more about that, there's a very good book called The Benderly Boys. And this is really a turning point. And Mordechai Kaplan and Rabbi Benderly were...
Rabbi.
Oh,
He's not
no,
a
he was
rabbi.
a doctor, right?
He was an
had a
educator.
But I think he had a PhD.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. We're teaching through the Jewish Theological Seminary. So those of you who may know about Reconstructionism, you may already know this, but Mordechai Kaplan taught in the Jewish Theological Seminary for 50 years. Not only taught, but he was the dean there, and he ran a teachers institute which trained folks who were becoming Jewish educators. And a big thrust of that was training them in Hebrew, to teach in the arts, to teach music, dance, and to create this kind of whole, what we think of as a whole child approach to Judaism, that it shouldn't just be academic and intellectual, but that it should really be part of an evolving civilization.
To change the subject a bit, how aware do you think Hadassah was of the Palestinian Arabs? And if she was aware of them, did she see them as a threat, as exotic, as irrelevant, or what?
Again, I try to understand the story based on the sources that I have. She doesn't write, to be honest, a lot about Palestinian Arabs. And it was one of the things that I was explicitly looking for when I went to look at the letter. Some of you might be familiar with Ari Shavit's My Promised Land. He describes in his, I don't remember if it's the introduction or the first chapter, he imagines what his grandfather saw when he comes in on the ship to Jaffa. And I too wanted to kind of stand on my grandma's shoulders and see, what did she see? What didn't she see? She saw when there were moments of conflict. So she arrives on basically Yom Kippur, and she immediately, the Day of Atonement, and she goes to the Kotel, the Western Wall, and she sees something that she's not quite sure what it is, and she tries to narrate what this exchange is. So there have been laws put into place by the British not to allow either a separation, a mechitza, a separation between men and women cannot be brought into this space. A shofar can't be blown in this space. There were all kinds of laws and there was an equivalent to stop Palestinian Arabs, Muslims, from performing their rituals in a way that might be viewed as provocative. And if you're familiar with the Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement service, you might know that the shofar, the ram's horn, is regularly blown at the end. And so they weren't supposed to blow it, but they did blow it. And she's sort of worried that there's going to be a big scuffle, and then they're told not to. So there are some kinds of interactions that happen. It's more a defensive response. She doesn't really know Palestinian Arabs. If she comes, it's also a class-based story. If she comes into contact with them, it is in a selling or transportation kind of mode. She is not befriending Palestinian Arabs, at least that I see references of in her letters or in her diary. But I do know that intellectually, she is engaging with these issues insofar as I mentioned before, that she, is reading different works that are engaging with some of these issues. I know much more than Hadassah. Mordechai Kaplan talks about these issues because he writes about them in his diary. He is following political events. So in 1929, there is it's called different things, and I debated for a long time with my editors over what I was going to call it. Is it an Arab riot? Is it an Arab uprising? I think Mordechai calls it an Arab outrage is the term that he uses for it. And I had to think about it because I wanted it to be in the index, but I wasn't sure what to label it as. That was a whole week of trying to decide, what is the language and what's the, it's the kind of thing that you do as a writer. You spend a week on something and nobody has any idea that it took you, why does it take you a decade? It took me a decade to write this book. Why? Possibly. Could it take you so long to write this book when you get caught up in these different things? So he goes to a protest and is very upset about these. It was similar in a way to October 7th, where many Jewish Palestinians, observant Jewish Palestinians who were not even necessarily Zionist in Jerusalem and in Sfat were killed. And he has a very emotional response in his diary to these uprisings. And he says, and he says something racist. I mean, he says, this is evidence that these are not people, I'm paraphrasing and I'm not getting it right, but, that he uses a term that they're as savage as Africans, and that they shouldn't be, entitled to national self-determination. That's not the term that he uses, but that's essentially what he says. And then 3 months later, he goes back in his diary and he says, what on earth was I thinking? I better go and revisit Achad Ha'am, because this is a country where Palestinian Arabs are the majority. And as I mentioned before, they were 85% were Palestinian Arabs. What vision did I have of how this was all going to work out? So people were thinking about these ideas. I know that Hadassah was engaged with some of them, but she wasn't going and developing significant relationships with Palestinian Arabs. You don't see a lot of her developing empathy for, much as I might have wished that she had.
Again, moving to a different slant, I don't know how many people here saw the wonderful series, I thought it was wonderful, called Beauty Queen of Jerusalem, which takes place during exactly the period that we're talking about. I have to say, when I read this book, I couldn't help thinking she was the Beauty Queen of Jerusalem. She was very beautiful. She was very young. She really had three different identities on this trip. She was the emissary of her father to find out what's really happening in the Yishuv. Yishuv being the word for the then very small settlement of Jews coming from other countries and settling there. She was her mother's daughter, whom she more or less was obedient, more rather less than more obedient to her mother's strictures about being chaperoned. And then she was herself a young, rather attractive woman in a brand new place, not really being supervised by anybody, and having a rather good time. So which of these identities do you think was predominant, or what that came through most vividly in the diaries?
I have to say that I love this question. I love it. I love it because it shows that you really heard the three stories that are woven together. And I'm a little hesitant. I mean, if I had to choose one, she's mostly a young woman trying to find her way. This is a coming of age story. And you know, it was meaningful to me. I described it at the beginning that it was meaningful to me when I started having conversations with my grandma about it, because I, of course, was a young person coming of age trying to figure out, like, I'm going to go abroad for 2 years and what's that going to mean. And I had met my husband just before I left, my future husband just before I left. And, you know, so there's a coming of age story. But as a mother, I'm a mother of 3 daughters also. And my eldest daughter was literally on a gap year as I was writing. I mean, it took me a long time to write this, so she was only on a gap year for a piece of it. But, you know, but I had my great grandma Lena sitting on my shoulder, reminding me what voice I should not be writing in to my child. And for those of you who have read or see it, you're laughing already, because she is very clear. I can give you a.
Now, darling, be careful.
Yeah. I am not so much worried, but annoyed at your mode of life since you left home. When you were here, you said that you were fed up with the nightclubs and dancing, etc., etc., and here you are, whether at Marseille, Alexandria, Cairo, or Jerusalem, you are doing the same thing all over again. You know, so this gives you a little sense that the book itself is very rich with the letters. So you hear the voices of the different people, and that includes the voice of her father, who says, he describes himself, he asks her, should he move to Palestine? And he says, I am like a juniper. And he writes this in Hebrew, and she writes back to him in Hebrew, but this is obviously translated. He says, I am like a juniper in the desert due to the wide distance between my views and aspirations and the views and aspirations of those with whom I interact at the various institutions at which I invest all my energy. And she does her due diligence. And she goes and talks to Henrietta Zold, and she talks to Jessie Samter. She talks to, one is a former student of her father's. Another was Henrietta Zold was a classmate. She was the founder of Hadassah, the organization, but she was also a classmate of Mordechai Kaplan at JTS. And asked them, you know, would Papa be happy here? And she has this wonderful answer that she gives before she does the due diligence, where she's such a teenager, you know, she says, I know that our life philosophies do not agree, because I am certain that all knowledge and work are necessary for someone only in order to make him happy. And what do you think? And she goes on to say, you know, you basically think you need to save the Jewish people, and haven't you done enough to save the Jewish people? Like, you would like it here. You could have a nice suburban home, and Mama could work in the garden, and you could work at the university, and, you know, but she knows that's not enough of an answer. So that's when she goes to Jessie Samter and Henrietta Zold. So I think I would answer that she actually tries very hard. I say this as a daughter. She tries hard to be a good daughter, both to her Mama and Papa, and she's also a rambunctious young person, and that's a big piece of this story. That this is the story of not only my grandma, but of a cohort of adventurous young American Jewish women who who had this opportunity to travel abroad and to express themselves in ways that they wouldn't have been able to.
Tell me when you want us to stop and let the audience ask. By the way, you should have mentioned that Henrietta Zoll said no. You
Yeah.
should not come.
Oh, yes, yes.
You should not come. You're needed. You're needed in America. Stay put.
Absolutely.
And she said the same thing to my father
Mhm.
in the following year when he was there, because he sort of wanted to be told he'd be useful in the yeshuv, and they said, no, you're an American rabbi, go do what you have to do. Be American rabbi. And I think they were disappointed to hear it. But in any event, quite a few of these people that Grandma Lena told her, go visit this one, go visit that one, were actually, you got to realize the yeshuv was extremely small. And so everybody who was anybody later became extremely famous and, all had government positions and were heads of this and heads of that. Do you think she was aware at the time quite how important these people were, or were they just people that Grandma Lena thought would make the appropriate company for her?
I think that she knew who they were. I think that she was pretty careful about, it's funny, I'm again looking at Rebecca too, because Rebecca, I think, remembers like the date book and all the people that Grandma would want us, I'm sure Sarah too, would want us to connect with, that these were the people who you should go ahead and make connections
Your
with.
Grandma Hadassah.
Yeah, my Grandma Hadassah. Sorry. She knew. There's one instance, she goes on a trip with Judah Magnus's son, and she can't stand him. She finds him completely overbearing, and she more or less tells him as much. She won't go to a dance with him, and she says, I'd rather stay home. I'd rather not go with anyone than go with him because I find him so overbearing. And then, later she is looking for invitations for the Passover Seder, and she really wants one from the Magnuses, and they don't invite her. And her mother writes to her, Lena writes to her and says, do you think it was because you were so terrible to David Magnus? But she knows. When she reaches out, she reads Judah Magnus's work, she reaches out to him to have a conversation. She's very happy that she's invited to have an intellectual conversation with him. She writes to Mama and Papa about what her conversation is about his writing in response to binationalism. She has a good sense of, she knew that she should go to see Henrietta Zoll, that she should go to see Jessie Samter, that her basically adolescent response to her father, like, oh, it'd be nicer. You don't have to carry the weight of American Jewry. You should just come. She knew that the right thing to do was to go and to ask around. So I think she had a good sense of that. I am thinking maybe we should.
Yeah, I think maybe it's time for the audience to have its questions.
Yeah, Adam.
In your book, you describe in detail the effect of what life was like during the Depression in Manhattan at that time, and how it wasn't such a factor in Palestine at that time. I think it'd be useful if you would explain that to the folks, because that was a key, I think, part of her leaving and staying away.
Yeah, thank you. And can I just introduce Adam and Mark here are Naomi, another daughter's children who are here with us right now. Thank you so much for being with us. Yes. The effect of the Great Depression was not as great in Palestine. There was a whole lot of building going on. There was a lot of economic activity. Even more than that, from Hadassah's perspective, she didn't have to keep up with the Joneses in the same kind of way. And that was true not just of Hadassah. And I know I've only just started to talk in this way, but Hadassah certainly was exceptional. My family is an exceptional. This is an exceptional story, but it also is part of a larger story. So Hadassah wasn't the only, one of the things that really interested me when I did this research was to learn that she wasn't the only one going to Palestine. She wasn't the only traveling young woman and even middle-aged woman. This was an acceptable thing for American Jewish women who had the means to do it, to go and adventure. These were women who were involved philanthropically, women who wanted to study, women who were social workers, women who were nurses, women who wanted to volunteer, women who wanted to learn, some of whom were older and had children, some of whom were divorced. I found it when I got on the ship with Hadassah, because I had the ship manifest. And I tracked down all the different people, and I tried to figure out, who's traveling by themselves and who's traveling with children, and who's who in this scenario. And there were many, often young to middle-aged women who were traveling unaccompanied, and they went to, including Hadassah's chaperones, so they could spend the year in Palestine, and it didn't matter if they didn't have the right clothing in the same kind of way. And this is a middle class, upper middle class kind of story where, fitting in a certain kind of way had a real import to it, especially, as someone who was looking for a marriage partner, as well as looking for a meaningful life, some kind of work, something along those lines. So yes, I have a song. It's set to Zoom Gali Gali, and it's I can't remember it off the top of my head, but it's a song about how we should go to Palestine because there's no depression there. So it was a way out for people who had the means to do it. And Jewish men had other opportunities with the means to do so, could go into higher education. And that there weren't as many opportunities for Jewish women with those kinds of means. So this created an opportunity. Thank you, Ad. Any other questions? Yeah. Will you introduce yourself?
It's not so much a question as an observation. My own mother and father are probably 10, 15 years younger. And my father was the absolute opposite of Mordecai Kaplan, but equally brilliant. Oh, I don't know if equally, who could be brilliant as that, but quite brilliant. And I was actually trained to be Jewishly, not just agnostic in the God sense, but in the religious identity sense. So I found reading your book, I read your book I haven't read 100% of it, but a lot of it, I just got so much of the feeling of Mordecai Kaplan and of Lena and their ideas about Judaism. And I picked up the spirit that I was actually raised with, but not with the connection, the powerful connection of Hebrew and Judaism. And it's always been perplexing for me to figure out this mystery of my not being my essence of Judaism. People who here know me as very Jewish, but I was so not raised with the specific Judaism. And reading your book really connected me to a piece of my own history without the actual religious identity. So thank you.
Tell me your name again.
Ellen Peckman.
Ellen, thank you so much for that comment. And I think it's pertinent for many people, and it goes to one of the central issues that Mordecai Kaplan was trying to respond to, right? He saw the problem of Judaism as being this kind of assimilation, right? And so you obviously got whatever kind of Jewish identity you got, and you're sitting here now, and that's wonderful. But that was part of the central problem that he wanted to address. He was very concerned, and he was specifically concerned about it for young women who weren't given the same kinds of encouragement and education, and that was part of the reason of creating the bat mitzvah as a ritual, which he initiated in 1922, 2 years after suffrage, after most women acquired the right to vote, because the idea was that if you could get more opportunities as a woman in the Christian world, in the general society, why would you stay on in a synagogue if you're relegated to the back seat and you're not allowed to play a leadership role? And he also saw Zionism. He writes this essay where he sees Zionism as the potential solution to women becoming involved in Jewish community and identity. Very interestingly, he writes it just as he's about to send Hadassah to, well, he doesn't send, but just as she's about to go, she actually types the essay for him, and she talks about reading it when it comes out. So he sees this as a potential solution. Interestingly, a few years later, when he rewrites the essay to publish it, first it's published in a journal, then it's published in a book that has a set of essays. Zionism has more or less come out of it. He's not seeing it as the same potential panacea, because everyone's ideas evolve over time.
I'd like to add a little bit to that, apropos of Ellen's comment.
A little louder, ma'am. Thanks.
There is a part of the book in which Hadassah visits one or more kibbutz. Now, the kibbutz movement was just getting underway. There weren't that many of them yet. And she was not exactly someone who was used to roughing it, except sort of at camp, maybe. And nonetheless, she does go to kibbutz, and this was a place where first, it was 100% secular. She was not used to living in a 100% secular life, and where you had to work physically, and she was expected to work physically, and she did, at least for a while. I just wonder what Sharon, I want to ask Sharon about that. How do you think she felt about kibbutz? Did the ideology appeal to her at all? Did the way of life appeal to her at all? Because that was something that not just secular, but really anti-religious young Jewish people were very much attracted to at this period.
So I think she was very drawn to the kibbutz, but not necessarily for ideological reasons. I think she loved the work. She was a very physical person. She was an athlete. I mean, when that summer in 1994, she was still beating, when she was 82, she was still beating me at tennis. She was a very physical person. I'm actually not that good at tennis. She was. And she wanted to do the physical work. I think there was, in her head, I don't think it was an explicitly feminist kind of thing, but she liked the idea that she wouldn't be excluded from doing what was considered men's work. And in the book I go through, there are other women who were excluded from doing that work. She doesn't seem to have run up against problems with that, and I think she loved that. But I think for her, she saw it as sort of like a camp experience, something that she was going to do for a little bit of time, but she kind of figured out, I don't think that this is going to work for the long term for who I want to be. And her family was really important to her, and she was worried about leaving them. I think they might have come. I mean, we didn't get into your story. You spent a sabbatical, not your sabbatical, but your father's sabbatical with Andy.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you were there. This is a story of back and forth. Not of, I go for a little bit of time and then I'm done. So the women who chaperoned Hadassah, many of them, as I mentioned before, worked for Hadassah, the organization, or Youth Aliyah. They would go back to Palestine and then to Israel once it became the state of Israel regularly. Annually, they would go back. And for women, especially at a time when there weren't as many professional opportunities, having these kinds of lay opportunities, lay leadership, volunteer opportunities were really profound.
Do you think at any point she seriously considered living there?
I think maybe she had a day or two when she thought about it. I don't think she thought about it much longer, but her father did. No?
No. That's a misunderstanding. He did not want to live there. He did not like the rabbinate. He did not like nationalism. He had great problems with it. He happened to, after Grandma died, he happened to remarry to a woman who lived in Israel. She had a house there. She wanted to go back. The initial agreement, which she should not have believed for a moment, the initial agreement was they would spend half time here and half time there, but they really got kind of old. I mean, he lived to be 102 and a half. And he was beginning to get, 90-ish when they finally decided they should move and just stay there. And that's what they did until he was 100, when he had to be basically carried back. He wanted to be buried in America. So this business about Mordecai Kaplan made Aliyah in his old age is simply not so. He spent most of his time there being furious. Of course, he was always furious about something, but he spent his time there being furious at the rabbinate and at the orthodoxy and at the power of the organized religion in Israel. So let's just get that one straight.
I'll just let me add one response to that, which is that I knew him as a child in Israel, which is where I met him first, I think, as a 6-year-old. We were kids, 3, 6, and 9. 3. That's a 3-year-old. And when I visited him there, he was old, but he had many students who came to see him, and he was very involved. He was angry. He had a lot of things that he was angry about. He was always had things that he was angry about and unhappy about in the United States as well as Israel. I didn't mean in any way to suggest that it was a panacea for him, but he did choose to live there for a period of time, which I think shows an ongoing relationship. He did come back here afterwards. Yeah, please, tell me your name.
Just a quick question. I'm Scott, pass it to you.
Thank you.
Good friends with Adam.
Nice.
Are there numbers that track how many American Jews have settled permanently in Israel?
Yes, there are. There are census numbers that give you those numbers, and they obviously change over time.
Do you have a sense as to how many over the century now?
I don't have a sense. I'm not great with numbers, so that's not a number that I can come up with off the top of my head. But I know that we could get that number. Yeah, I trust Rebecca.
One of the things that we do know is that while there is a core group of Americans who did go and settle, probably 2/3 of the Americans who went came back.
Yes.
They didn't stay for many different reasons. But what I wanted to say,
Who are you, by the way?
I'm Kayla Niles.
Oh, hi, Kayla.
From Adat Shalom.
Yes, yay.
And Reconstructionist, back to the point where I studied with Dr. Kaplan. He invited me to attend one of his classes during the last years he was teaching at JTS.
Nice.
And I was a student in the Teachers Institute, which was still Ivrit, everything. We studied everything in Hebrew, and that was Kaplan's thing.
And Bender's.
I loved the book. The instant I saw a notice about it, I bought it and read it. You paint a picture of what Palestine was like, which is very beautiful, very realistic, and I really enjoyed reading that. I think for many American Jews, Israel burst fully formed either in 1948 or 1967 even. And there is very little in English to be read in popular literature. There have been a number of books in the last couple of years about the Arab Rebellion and about what life was like, whatever. But you paint a wonderful picture, especially from a woman's point of view, because that's culture, and Israel to this day is so gender defined and difficult, especially for American Jewish women. But she was very fortunate, I think, because of all these connections that her parents had. I can't imagine that she really grasped at that age that these people were going to become so important in Israeli history and in Jewish history. But they were the absolutely top, the cream of society in the Yishuv, and she met them all. And I met some of them later, and as I said when I came in, one of the things that I enjoyed the most is as I was turning the pages, I kept meeting people that I knew, but I met them as very old people,
Yeah.
and she met them as very young people, and it was wonderful to hear the descriptions and to hear about them. So I recommend it very highly.
She's not a plant.
Thank you so much. I see that we're at 8 o'clock. Should we
We'll let that lady.
call that, should we take one more question or call that?
Sure, why don't we do one more question, and then Sharon's gonna go back here and sign copies of the book at this table.
And
And if you'd like to get a copy, we have them here.
2 more questions?
you know what, can I hear the two questions together and then I'll answer them together? And let me just say, I'm happy to answer anyone's questions. I have my card on the table, so if we need to stay after people close, you can always write to me, so I'm always happy to follow up. So tell me
I'll try to make
your
it
name
really
and your
brief.
question. Yeah.
Ariel Grill.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to make it quick. I thought what was so special about this book was that it was written by her granddaughter. So for those of us with a great relationship with our grandmother, that permeates the whole book, and I loved it. I was wondering how you navigated the role of author and granddaughter when revealing things about your grandma, which maybe people in the family want to hide, or not hide, but like maybe it wasn't the first thing that you would say about your grandma. Like she hooked up a lot with various men in various places, or just there were numerous times when I thought like that must have been difficult to decide as the granddaughter.
Thank you. I'm gonna get that and tell me.
I just wanted to,
And they're not here today. Go ahead.
I just wanted to ask Mim how Mordecai Kaplan was able to deal with the lack of assimilation during that time in Israel, because I lived there for over 2 years in 1965, and people hadn't assimilated yet. I lived on a kibbutz, on they called it Yeki, on a kibbutz that was run by the Germans, and my sister fell in love with a Moroccan, and the madrich of the Ulpan said, don't go near him, he's only after women that have money. I mean, there was so much, there was such bad feeling amongst people, Ashkenazis and Sephardim then at that time. I don't know what year your father was there, but you said he came back and forth as well. How was he able to come in and out of Israel so much?
My father or my grandfather?
Your grandfather, excuse me.
He didn't go up back and forth that much, actually. And you gotta understand, my grandfather lived in a very particular Israel. He lived in Hebrew University Israel. And Zionism for him was Hebrew University Zionism. I think he knew theoretically about many of the social problems, but he wasn't really in them at all. And the going back and forth was when he was quite elderly.
Thank you. So I'm going to take two together to the extent that that was for me. It's really, really complicated writing a family history. And I would say that the complications have less to do with my relationship with my grandma, because she had passed away before I inherited these papers and got to read them. But I have parents, and I have aunts and uncles and cousins, and lots of people who have lots of opinions. I will say, as you see, and I'm blessed by that. I had to make an authorial decision. Early on, I shared an article. I wrote and published an article and got lots of feedback on it from the family as well. It's the exchange in Hebrew between, because my grandma wrote to her father in Hebrew once her Hebrew got good enough, and he wrote back to her in Hebrew. And it was that exchange over should he move to Palestine and her suggestions on that. And I got lots and lots of helpful feedback, and I made the decision that I wasn't going to share more manuscript material until the book came out. So literally when the book came out, I took a copy and I sent it to Uncle Daniel, and I sent it to my father, and I had a letter, and I said, I love you. I love Grandma, and you know I love it. And there's Warren Bass. It's so good to see you. And I said, you know, I wrote this book, out of love for my grandma, out of a sense of devotion to my children and the desire to perpetuate their Jewish identity, and I hope that you will read it in that way. And then I called Mim and I made sure that she had a copy, and here we are. And so it's really complicated. That's the answer. I wrote my my first, because I'm looking at a grad school friend in the back, I wrote my first graduate paper thesis on British women who immigrated to Israel between 1965 and 1975, and I looked at their assimilation process, their motivations for migrating and their assimilation process. 5 of them went back, and I did oral histories for it. This was right after, that was when I went to England that time in 1994 and did that. I'd be happy to share the article with you, but it has a lot about the difficulties of assimilation and how people manage that might be of interest to you. Thank you so much. You guys have been such an amazing audience. Thank you for coming out on this strange night. I'm happy to sign copies in bat mitzvah fashion. I have swag, whether or not you buy a book. I have bookmarks and postcards, and I have my card in case anybody wants to be in touch. Thank you so much.
Good.